25 years after the day two teenagers vanished into the Alaska mist, the Seward Highway case, thought to have died with time, suddenly echoed with a spine-chilling call. One night, in the dusty old records room of the Alaska State Troopers, a sealed box was opened, and the moment something rolled out, the air seemed to thicken. Seasoned investigators stood frozen before a tiny piece of evidence that was almost too small to believe, yet it carried the scent of truth. The kind of truth that had been buried under the Kenai forest floor for nearly 3 decades. In the Seward community, forbidden stories resurfaced, tales of a man standing at the edge of the woods, nameless, the silhouette of an old black pickup that appeared and vanished like a demon, and the haunting obsession that a predator had once walked among them, right on the roads they lived on, and had never paid the price. The whispers from 1997 were 2 kids running away. Or was there a third person, rang out again like an old wound being sliced open. As the old files were laid on the table, the rustling of paper sounded like a call from the past. The photos of Marina's body lying in Bear Creek Forest, the dark scraps of fabric caught on branches, and the faint footprints that looked deliberately erased, everything began to fall into place in a terrifying way. Then, when the new DNA results appeared, cold and merciless like a verdict from fate, everything changed. The 1997 case wasn't just a tragedy, it was a ghost that had never left Alaska. And when the name appeared on the screen, the one no one had suspected, the one who had blended into everyday life, the entire investigation room fell silent. No one spoke, because everyone understood this was no longer just a case. It was a reminder that sometimes the devil doesn't hide in the dark. He stands right in the light, waiting for the right moment to disappear with 2 kids from that summer. Before we dive deeper into this shocking true story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love journeys in search of forgotten justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. Summer of 1997, the Seward Highway stretched through thick fog and the hazy Kenai Mountains, in the distance, so deserted that every sound of a distant truck echoed in the cold air. That afternoon, Evan Hartley, 19, and Marina Doyle, 17, left the Harborview Inn, a small motel right on the edge of the forest. After packing up their last few things to continue their trip to Anchorage, they walked along the shoulder of the road, backpacks on, laughing and talking while watching the sparse traffic pass through the white mist. At the gas station near the Seward Highway turnoff, security cameras captured the last images of them both, standing by the old pumps, holding a sign that read, Anchorage, occasionally waving when a car went by. In the grainy footage typical of that era, you can see Evan adjusting his backpack strap while Marina briefly turns to look toward the tree line as if she heard something. One witness, a local truck driver, later said that as he passed the gas station, he caught a glimpse of a man standing at the edge of the woods, slightly back in the shadows, apparently watching the 2 kids. He didn't get a clear look at the face, only remembering a tall, thin build, and a dark jacket that gave him a chill for a moment. But when he looked again, the figure had vanished behind the trees. The afternoon passed, and no one saw Evan or Marina on that stretch of road again. By evening, Marina's family called repeatedly but got no answer. Evan's phone was completely off. From 8 p.m. until nearly midnight, both sets of parents tried friends and motels along the route, but no one knew where they were. When the clock neared 1, with still no sign, worry turned to panic. Marina's family was the first to call the police, kicking off a long, tense night that no one imagined would become the start of one of the most mysterious disappearances in Alaska that summer. To the small duty room of the Alaska State Troopers in the Seward area, Sergeant Mark Ellison, on night shift that evening, picked up amid the faint static of the radio and the howling wind outside the window. On the other end was a trembling woman's voice, trying to stay calm while repeating that her daughter Marina Doyle and her friend Evan Hartley had been out of contact for hours and hadn't returned as planned. Ellison fired off the essential questions: last seen, planned route, who they were with, how many calls had been made. When he heard the 2 were hitchhiking at the gas station near Seward Highway, his expression changed visibly. In the wilds of Alaska in 1997, hitchhiking at dusk was always something that put cops on high alert. He immediately notified the duty supervisor, then hit the quiet alarm button to summon the night shift rapid response team. In under 20 minutes, 3 trooper SUVs rolled out, lights cutting through the fog, heading for the gas station where the camera had last recorded Evan and Marina. When they arrived, the parking lot was dead quiet except for the constant yellow glow of the old gas station light. Ellison and 2 other investigators checked the footage. It was exactly as the families had described: Evan with his backpack, Marina fixing her hair before holding up the Anchorage sign. They stood there a few minutes, then stepped to the edge of the road and vanished from the frame. No footage of them getting into a vehicle, no interaction with a stranger, just one strange moment. Marina turns her head toward the woods, as if hearing a sound, and for a split second, a figure is visible in the shadows of the tree. No clear face, no clear clothing, just a tall shape, leaning slightly forward as if watching. Ellison flagged that frame in the report, then set up an immediate search perimeter. The search team split into 3 groups. One swept along Seward Highway, one pushed into the forest along Bear Creek, and the last expanded onto the trail running parallel to the highway. The Alaskan night was freezing. The searchers' breath dissolved into fog just feet off the ground. Flashlights swept every corner of the woods, glinting silver off spruce trunks. It wasn't long before the trail group radioed in. They'd found the first item. A few small things scattered near the path. A bottle cap, a scrap of paper with hurried writing, and a backpack strap stretched as if it had just taken a hard yank. Not far away, a low branch, freshly broken, sap still oozing, proving it had been snapped very recently. An investigator knelt to examine the ground. Footprints, but blurred by wind and trampled by the rescue team's own boots. Small prints, large prints, and long drag marks, like someone had been pulled or was staggering. But neither direction nor number of people involved could be determined. A short distance from there was a more significant find: Marina's backpack. It lay on its side in low brush, main compartment unzipped, but everything inside virtually untouched: jacket, travel journal, a pencil. No sign of rummaging or robbery. That sent a chill down Ellison's spine. If someone opened the pack and took nothing, this wasn't a property crime, it was something far more serious. As the forensics team worked the area, they uncovered one more small metal object hidden under damp leaves. A keychain shaped like a bird cage, steel hook slightly rusted, unusual old design. No one on the team recognized it, and later the families confirmed it didn't belong to Evan or Marina. The keychain was bagged and tagged as evidence. Moving deeper along the trail, the terrain grew more complex: wet ground, slick rocks, crisscrossing footprints with no clear direction, prints running into the woods, prints heading back to the road, and faint drag marks that disappeared on hard rocky ground. It was all like an unfinished painting, just enough to show something had happened, but not enough to piece together the whole picture. By near dawn there was still no further sign of Evan or Marina. Ellison gathered the team to file a preliminary report before daylight. What they had was scattered belongings, an unzipped backpack, a strange keychain, and countless traces that led nowhere specific. But Ellison's gut, honed by more than 20 years working Alaska, told him this wasn't just 2 young people getting lost. Something else had happened in the brief window after the gas station camera stopped recording them. The heavy silence at the temporary command post after the first night's search felt like a void everyone was trying to fill with hope, but that hope faded fast as teams pushed deeper into Bear Creek Forest. Not long after the second group fanned out along a narrow trail paralleling the creek, the radio crackled. Trooper Hale's voice hoarse, reporting they had found something that looks like a human body deep in the woods. Ellison's team immediately redirected, pushing through cold, wet underbrush, where spruce branches intertwined like a natural barricade, creating tighter and darker spaces than anywhere they'd searched before. When Ellison arrived, he immediately recognized the small figure of Marina Doyle lying on her side beneath an old spruce. Half her body was concealed by low-hanging branches, making the body easy to miss unless a light swept exactly the right way. Marina was wearing the thin gray jacket her mother said was still new, but from the neck down there were clear horizontal bruises, classic ligature marks from manual strangulation. No signs of strong resistance or deep scratches on her arms, meaning she was subdued very quickly, with no chance to fight back. One chilling detail: Marina had no shoes. Her white socks were caked with mud and decayed leaves, proving she had walked at least the final few steps before death. But if she was attacked here, where were her shoes? Did the killer take them, or had she fled in desperation and lost them somewhere along the way? That anomaly became the first detail that made the team feel they were dealing with a calculated perpetrator, not a crime of passion. The ground around the body wasn't large, but it revealed a few notable signs: slight scuffling, one large, rain-blurred footprint, pointing toward the tree then vanishing into mossy rock. Forensics couldn't confirm whether it was Evan's, but it was bigger than Marina's foot and deeper, as if the person had been standing or moving with considerable weight. Nearby, a few dark fibers stuck to low grass, possibly from gloves or a jacket. Not much, but for experienced investigators, the kind of clue that can become the key if analyzed properly. As they swept the surrounding area, investigators noted there were no long drag marks, meaning Marina's body hadn't been moved from elsewhere. She died right here or very close by. That made the picture even more tense. Marina had gone into the woods with Evan, died here in a very short time, and Evan had vanished. No belongings, no traces, no sign he'd been attacked at the same spot. Evan's absence became the biggest hole in the entire scene. No one knew exactly when he disappeared. No clear footprints, no blood, no dropped personal items. It felt as if he had been erased from the area after Marina died, or had left before the attack. That very lack of information led the early theory Evan may be involved in Marina's death to creep into preliminary reports. Back at the temporary command post, Ellison stared at the freshly updated map. A red pin marked the gas station, the last place the kids were seen on camera. A yellow pin marked where Marina's backpack was found, and now a black pin for the body. The points were less than a few miles apart, but between them lay dense forest, rocky hills and patches of darkness the sun never reached. Someone unfamiliar with the terrain couldn't move quickly through it. Yet the perpetrator had or at least knew how to use the landscape to stay hidden. In the report sent to headquarters, forensics noted Marina died not long after being recorded on camera, meaning the same day she vanished. And that was the part that unsettled the team most. If Marina died that early, where had Evan been the whole time? Why was there no trace of him? And most importantly, was he still alive when Marina was attacked? Those questions became the focus of the brief meeting right after the body was removed from the forest. Many opinions were cautious, but some investigators said the possibility Evan was the last person with Marina couldn't be ignored. That became the first and most common investigative direction in cases where two people disappear together but only one body is found. Ellison didn't say it out loud, but he knew that from the moment Marina was discovered, all pressure would shift to finding Evan. Not just to save him if he was still alive, but to answer the unavoidable question, was he a witness, a kidnapping victim, or the killer? As the wind whipped through the trees that afternoon, Ellison looked back down the trail leading to where the body lay. A different kind of cold, not Alaska's usual chill, ran down his spine. The feeling of a case that was anything but simple, where the person responsible might be walking right past them, or had already melted into the mist, leaving nothing but traces deliberately lost in the natural chaos of Bear Creek Forest. As soon as Marina's body was carried out of the forest, the command post sank into a thick atmosphere of confusion and suspicion. Witness statements started pouring in all at once, and the first one that caught Ellison's attention came from a middle-aged man who insisted he had seen Evan walking alone, looking panicked, near the turnoff to Bear Creek, late the previous afternoon. He described Evan walking fast, glancing back over his shoulder every few steps, as if someone were chasing him. Though the statement was vague, it arrived at the exact moment police had just discovered Marina dead, forcing the investigation team to log it as a critical detail. Another couple of tourists said they saw Evan and Marina having a mild argument near the grassy area next to the gas station. They couldn't hear the words, but they were certain Marina looked annoyed, while Evan kept his voice low. The statement couldn't be fully verified, yet it helped paint a contradictory picture of the two kids' final hours. Among the other accounts, some said the pair had been walking very close together, looking affectionate. Others said Evan hung back while Marina walked ahead. Each testimony was a puzzle piece that refused to fit, making the timeline harder, not easier to reconstruct. When news of Marina's death spread, local media instantly seized on Evan's disappearance and ran sensational headlines. Boyfriend vanishes after teen girl found dead. Police investigating possible personal dispute. Although police had never called Evan a suspect, the necessary silence of the early stage was twisted by the press into something sinister. Public opinion quickly tilted toward the theory that Evan might have killed her and fled, especially since no one had seen him after leaving the gas station. Marina's family, reeling from sudden grief, also began to waver. No one directly accused Evan, but questions like, could they really have been fighting? Or might Evan have done something stupid? Crept into every quiet conversation among them. Those speculations, however unintentional, placed heavy pressure on Evan's family, who were already terrified for their missing son, and now had to face the community's suspicious stares. Evan's parents rushed to the police station the moment they learned Marina had been found. They brought photos of the two kids beaming on their trip, text messages, and handwritten notes that showed how close they were. They insisted Evan could never hurt Marina, but Ellison knew that emotional testimony, no matter how sincere, couldn't change the direction of an investigation, when the hard evidence still pointed to Evan's inexplicable disappearance at the exact time Marina died. In internal reports, police couldn't rule out the possibility Evan had been present when Marina was attacked. There was no sign of any of his belongings near the body, an odd detail if the two had been moving through the forest together. Yet that very absence made Evan the X factor. Either he fled the area after a struggle, or he had become a second victim somewhere else entirely. The complete lack of any trace of Evan troubled Ellison more than anything, but it was also the reason Evan could not be removed from the suspect list. As media kept splashing Evan's photo alongside misleading headlines, the public began treating him as the killer. The tip lines flooded with baseless reports. People saw Evan in Anchorage, Fairbanks, even heading toward Canada. All of it was speculation, yet it diluted the credible leads. Every false sighting cost the team more time and ramped up the pressure to produce answers. Ellison quietly watched it all, trying not to get swept up in the swelling tide of suspicion. He believed any rushed conclusion now could ruin the investigation. But with only one body recovered and the other person completely vanished, even the most cautious investigators understood Evan's name had to stay at the very top of the list they were searching for, both as a potential victim and as a suspect with motives still unexplained. On the second night of the expanded search, as Ellison stood in front of the map marked with 3 pins, the gas station, the trailhead, and the spot where Marina was found, he couldn't shake the feeling that Evan's disappearance was not as simple as the public narrative claimed. Something in Bear Creek Forest still hadn't been uncovered, and until they found Evan, alive or dead, the case would keep revolving around his name like the center of every suspicion. The relentless pressure after Evan was pushed into the top suspect spot forced Ellison to take the most critical early step in any missing persons case: rebuild the complete timeline before the two kids vanished. He gathered the investigators in the small temporary meeting room set up in the gas station parking lot, where a whiteboard stood in the center covered with notes stuck to all 4 corners. Every piece of information from security footage, witness statements, and collected documents was strung together, yet the more they pieced it, the murkier the picture became instead of clear. The clearest point in the timeline was the gas station camera capturing Evan and Marina at 12:27 p.m. Marina holding up the Anchorage sign, Evan wearing his backpack and adjusting the straps. They showed no signs of tension, directly contradicting the claims of a mild argument. When Ellison played the video in slow motion, he noticed the moment Marina turned her head toward the tree line, as if something in the woods had caught her attention. That detail became the only fixed anchor in the early part of the timeline that no one could explain. The team re-examined every witness statement from around the gas station. The problem was that every account placed the kids in a different spot at the same general time. The couple who said they saw an argument near the grass thought it was around noon, but no one could pin down whether it was before or after the camera timestamp. The man who claimed he saw Evan alone and panicked said it was late afternoon. Yet when cross-checked with gas station records, there was no evidence Evan ever returned to the area that afternoon. Even the lighting in the witness's memory contradicted the actual time of day. The overlapping statements left a total blind spot from 12:30 to 1:15 p.m. No one could confirm which direction the couple went, whether they got into anyone's car, or who they might have met during that window. To clarify things, Ellison ordered a review of every motel register in the area for the night before Marina and Evan disappeared. When they re-examined the registration log at the Harborview Inn, the desk clerk produced a copy showing a signature under the name Evan Hart. However, a sharp-eyed investigator noticed the handwriting had oddly elongated strokes, as if the writer had deliberately altered the slant and spacing to fake it. A quick comparison with handwriting samples from Evan's notebook provided by his parents made the difference obvious. The motel signature was not his. The issue wasn't whether Evan had signed in. It was the far more disturbing question: if Evan didn't sign it, who did? And what connection did that person have to the fact that both kids vanished the very next day? The handwriting discrepancy rocked the entire team because it suggested someone had interfered with Evan and Marina's plans as early as the night before. Ellison believed this could be the first real sign of a third party, someone who knew where they were staying, where they were going, and even how to muddy the trail. When they moved on to analyzing the scene where Marina's body was found, the forensics team presented footprint comparison. The large prints near the body were longer and deeper than Evan's shoe size. According to his family, Evan wore lightweight size 10.5 trekking shoes. The prints recovered were wider and deeper, consistent with someone at least 20 pounds heavier. Moreover, the tread pattern didn't match Evan's shoes at all. That evidence directly contradicted the theory that Evan was present when Marina was attacked. Yet the total absence of any trace of Evan in the area made it impossible to either clear him or confirm his role. The more pieces Ellison fitted together, the more he realized the case wasn't following normal logic. The kids were captured on camera acting perfectly normal. An hour later, no one knew where they had gone. Marina died less than a mile from the gas station, yet Evan left no trace at all. Whether as perpetrator or second victim, he would have had to move through areas likely to preserve footprints or belonging. A broken timeline, a forged motel register, and mismatched footprints all felt like pieces of a puzzle deliberately scrambled before being handed to police. Standing in front of the timeline board with huge gaps stretching from noon into the afternoon, Ellison knew this was where the strangeness began. If they couldn't fill those 45 missing minutes, they would never understand what happened to Marina, and more importantly, they would never know where Evan was in the tens of thousands of hectares of Alaskan wilderness. Just as the team was still struggling with the unfillable gap in the timeline, Ellison received a call about a new lead from a man claiming he had driven past the Seward Highway at noon on the exact day the kids disappeared. The tip arrived at a moment that felt either perfectly timed or highly suspicious, when every investigative thread was stretched thin and no detail held up for more than a few hours. Ellison immediately arranged to meet the man at the temporary office beside the gas station, where the witness showed up looking both anxious and eager to help. The man said he saw a dark-colored older pickup truck with a single cab. According to him, Evan and Marina climbed into the truck bed just minutes after the gas station camera filmed them. He described the driver as middle-aged, long hair, wearing a denim jacket, and said the truck headed toward Anchorage. He stressed that he remembered it clearly because he had planned to stop and offer the kids a ride himself, but the pickup got there first. The information instantly upended the entire timeline board. If true, it meant the pivotal event, the one no camera caught, happened only yards from the lens. Ellison asked the witness to pinpoint exactly where he had been standing when he saw it. The man pointed to a spot near a rock embankment on the roadside, outside the gas station camera's field of view. Everything sounded plausible, but the deeper Ellison probed, the more troubling inconsistencies appeared. First, the distance and timing didn't add up. If Evan and Marina got into a pickup, the truck should have appeared at least briefly on the main road camera, because although the angle was narrow, it still covered vehicles stopping near the pumps. Yet when technicians reviewed every frame, they found no trace of a dark pickup, no headlights, no reflection, no unusual engine noise on the audio. Second, the driver's description shifted tellings. The first time the witness said the driver was middle-aged. The second time, when pressed for precision, he said maybe just over 30. That lack of consistency forced Ellison to note suspicion, though he kept his demeanor calm so the witness wouldn't feel attacked. Third, and most crucial, no other witness, neither customers pumping gas, passing divers, nor gas station staff saw a pickup at that time. That left the statement dangerously isolated. Either the witness was lying, his memory had been distorted by time, or he had seen something, but not on that day. In the quick debrief afterward, a younger investigator vented in frustration. He made it up, or he just wants to feel important. But Ellison refused to jump to conclusions. He twirled his pen and reminded the team, no lead is useless until we're certain it's false, and a false lead still has value. It tells us what didn't happen. When they cross-checked the statement against the new data, Ellison wrote two temporary conclusions on the board. Not enough evidence to say Evan left the gas station in a pickup truck. Cannot completely rule out the possibility a stranger approached the two victims. In reality, the false lead clarified something important. If a third party existed, that person had approached Evan and Marina during the window no camera covered, in a way so discreet, no one else noticed. That meant the perpetrator was very likely local, someone familiar with the terrain. the gas station's routines, and every camera blind spot. By the end of the day, Ellison reached a provisional conclusion, one he hadn't been ready to accept just hours earlier. Nothing proved Evan was the killer, but the case definitely involved a third party, someone who had actively approached and separated the two kids from the busy roadside area. The investigation began moving in a far more dangerous direction. There wasn't just one dead victim. If Evan was not the perpetrator, then he was a second missing victim somewhere in a wilderness vast enough to swallow both people and evidence whole, leaving nothing behind but an ever-growing pile of questions. The suspicions about the pickup truck, though still lacking solid evidence, were enough for Ellison to order the search team to expand the sweep into the dense forest right beside Bear Creek, where Marina's body had been found. He wanted to confirm whether any vehicle had stopped there, even for just a few minutes, long enough to drag or carry someone into that area. As the searchers fanned out along narrow trails leading deeper into the woods, one investigator shouted, his voice carrying a rare note of excitement. They had found tire tracks. The spot was a narrow patch of sandy dirt, roughly 100 meters off the main road. The tire impressions were faint, but clear enough to tell they didn't belong to a typical SUV or passenger car. Wide tread, deep grooves. The edges of the tracks slightly collapsed, characteristics that closely matched an older model pickup truck. They couldn't identify the make or year, but for Ellison, just knowing a vehicle had entered this area around the time of the crime was a major breakthrough. A few meters away, another investigator spotted a faint drag mark on the ground, long shallow scrapes, as if someone had been pulled but hadn't struggled hard. The drag trail led from the trail toward the forest edge, perfectly aligning with the direction to where Marina had been discovered. When the two details were put together, the drag marks and the likelihood of a vehicle stopping, the idea of a third person present grew sharper and more convincing. The forensics team immediately began photographing, measuring, and modeling the scene. They flagged every drag line, every compressed patch of soil, and even small scrape marks near tree roots that might indicate resistance. For the first time since Marina's body was found, the entire team felt they were closing in on a plausible, reconstructible scenario. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood. These traces strongly suggested Marina had been dragged from a safer area, while Evan had left no footprints anywhere nearby, meaning he wasn't present for the event. But just as hope flickered, the sky suddenly darkened. A cold, wet wind swept through the grass, and minutes later an Alaskan summer rain came down fast, hard, and more merciless than any southern downpour. Before the team could fully protect their equipment, mud began spreading across the sandy ground, washing away the faintest groove. The tire tracks blurred right in front of their eyes. The shallowest drag marks vanished within seconds. Ellison barked orders to secure the scene, but it was impossible. The fragility of the traces, already barely surviving nearly a full day, couldn't withstand the deluge that seemed determined to erase everything. In less than half an hour, the area that had been the most crucial piece of the investigation turned into a mess of mud and leaves. The drag marks melted into the mottled surface. The tire tread was wiped clean to the point that even the technicians couldn't point to where it had been. When the rain stopped, a thin steam rose from the wet ground, carrying a bone-chilling cold that felt like pure despair poured into the air. Ellison stood staring at the muddy patch beneath his feet, silent. He knew exactly what they had just lost. Not just evidence, but their only chance to prove that the witness's story about the pickup truck, however flawed, still reflected part of the truth. That night, when the report went to headquarters, the conclusion was reduced to a single line: no longer possible to determine whether a vehicle stopped at the scene. And with the loss of the only clues linking a potential perpetrator to the scene, the investigation officially sank into its darkest dead end yet. The heavy rain had erased every trace around Bear Creek, and a quiet despair settled over the investigation team. When the final attempts to reconstruct the scene failed, the case entered a phase of total stagnation. They kept searching for weeks afterward, but Alaska's forest is too vast, too wet, and too many areas are unreachable in time. Every trace they hoped to find dissolved before they could reach it. Time dragged on. 1 month turned into 2, then 6, and by the 6th month, the search teams had to accept there was no sign Evan was still anywhere along the Seward Highway. Searches with tracking dogs, thermal imaging flights, volunteer groups, local hunters, everything came up empty. People started whispering that he had either fled or died somewhere too remote for anyone to ever find. The media kept pushing the most damaging narrative: if Evan is innocent, why did he disappear the exact moment Marina was killed? That question cornered his family into constant defense. They fiercely protected their son, but without evidence they couldn't break the growing public conviction that Evan might be the killer on the run. In reality, the police had never officially concluded that, but the information vacuum let the public write its own story. Meanwhile, in the evidence vault, the few remaining items from the case were sealed away. A strange key fob that belonged to neither Evan nor Marina, the only detail hinting at a third person's presence. A dark fabric cord that could be harmless or could have been used to bind or drag. A small blood stain collected on a rock near Marina's body. Everything was placed in a sealed box labeled D97. The blood sample was too small and already oxidized. The state DNA lab at the time couldn't extract enough data for comparison. The DNA analysts could only write, "insufficient sample to identify or exclude any individual." That meant they couldn't prove Evan innocent, and they couldn't charge him either. Ellison was especially fixated on the key fob. He believed it was the real key to the case, but no one could trace its origin. No one knew what vehicle it went to, or even whether it belonged to the killer, or had simply been dropped there long before. With no way to verify, it was classified as evidence of undetermined value. Every other lead slowly hit a brick wall. The pickup truck sighting contradicted camera data. The drag marks were completely destroyed by rain. The tire tracks no longer existed for analysis. Local tips about seeing Evan in Anchorage, or hearing screams in the woods, were logged and then dismissed. Foggy memories and collective fear made many people hear a story and then believe they had witnessed. By late winter, when snow buried the Seward Highway and all search efforts had to stop, Ellison sat alone in his office, staring at the map of Alaska's mountains covered in marks he'd made over the past 6 months. Almost every mark carried the same meaning: nothing. In the final report to his superiors, he had to write the line he'd avoided for months: case temporarily closed. No further progress. The Marina Doyle case joined Alaska's list of hundreds of unsolved cold cases, and Evan Hartley, with no evidence to convict, no evidence to exonerate, no trace of life, no trace of death, became a mysterious shadow suspended between two possibilities. Still, Ellison refused to fully let go. Before placing the evidence box on the cold storage shelf, he wrote a private note only he would ever read. Insufficient basis to conclude Evan committed the crime. Insufficient basis to declare Evan deceased. Await future scientific advancement. And he was right. Science would eventually return to this case, but it would take nearly 2 decades, when a new technology appeared that no one in 4 years had passed since the file was temporarily closed, and the Evan Marina case had gathered thick dust alongside countless other missing persons files in Alaska. But for Ellison, it had never truly ended. Every time he walked past the storage shelves, boxed in 9741 Bear Creek always made him pause for a few seconds, a reminder that something remained unexplained, a truth still lying silent in the mountains. Early September, on a gray autumn afternoon, Ellison got a call from the trooper post in Seward. The duty officer's voice trembled slightly, as if unsure how big this news would be for a case that had slept for 4 years. "We've got a hunter who reported finding human remains near Lost Lake, likely a young male. You should come now." Lost Lake was more than 10 miles of rough forest from where Marina had been found, far enough that no one had ever thought to extend the search grid that far. The terrain was treacherous, steep, with snow covering it most of the year, so the area had been ruled out of every prior theory, but the hunter's report was enough for Ellison to jump in his truck and head straight to Seward. The hunter was a local, a seasoned middle-aged man, who knew the wilderness well, his face full of unease. He led them down a narrow trail on a rocky slope to a damp, cold stand of spruce. There, beneath dense branches, scattered human bones lay exposed among soft moss and rotting leaves. Even a layperson could tell this skeleton had been here for years. Forensics quickly sealed the area. The bones were collected piece by piece: ribs, pelvis, skull fragments with old crack. But one detail silenced everyone. The wrist bones showed strange wear, as if they had been tightly bound for a long time. On the ground nearby lay rusted metal fragments, remains of homemade restraints or handcuffs. No one spoke it aloud, but everyone understood what this discovery meant. If this was Evan, he wasn't the killer. He was a victim. Still, they couldn't jump to conclusions. Human remains don't always match the expected identity, but when a technician found a small rotten scrap of fabric under the damp soil, a piece of the denim jacket Evan's family had described, Ellison knew he was standing in front of the answer he'd waited years for. Once forensics finished collecting everything, it was transported to the Anchorage lab. Extracting DNA from bones nearly 4 years old was never easy, but technology had advanced significantly since 1997. Marrow remaining in a femur segment was sampled. Analysis took weeks, and during that time, Ellison felt like he was waiting for a verdict on the question that had haunted him for thousands of nights. Did Evan do it, or was he a victim of the same person who killed Marina? Finally, on a cold early morning, the lab called. We have the result. DNA is a 100% match for Evan Hartley. Ellison said nothing for several seconds. He just stood there, gripping the edge of the desk as the weight of the news settled on his shoulders after 4 long years. Then the examiner continued. Additionally, we confirmed the wrist bones show restraint marks. Very high probability Evan was bound before death. The message was concise, scientific and cold, but it was enough to turn the entire case upside down. Ellison immediately called a meeting with his superiors. The new report overturned every previous assumption. Evan did not flee. Evan did not kill Marina. Evan was restrained, bound and murdered. The killer moved his body more than 10 miles from the original scene. The possibility of a third person, once considered weak, distracting and unsupported, now became the centerpiece of a brand new investigation. The file was reopened, but this time with a completely different direction. When the news reached Evan's family, their small living room filled with 2 opposing emotions: crushing grief at learning their son was dead, and overwhelming relief that at last, Evan had been cleared. His mother, who had endured 4 years of hell under headlines questioning her son, collapsed, sobbing and whispering thanks that the truth had finally come out. Local media, which had once painted Evan as the fugitive, instantly changed tone. From suspect to second victim, headlines exploded across papers. Remains near Lost Lake confirm, Evan Hartley murdered, 1997 case reversed. But for Ellison, this was not the end. It was the start of the most dangerous phase, hunting the person who killed both Marina and Evan, a killer who knew the terrain, had a vehicle, understood how to erase traces, and was patient enough to turn 2 kids into ghosts in the old-growth forest. Now, with Evan confirmed as a victim, Alaska law enforcement had the strongest reason yet to reopen the entire file using technologies that didn't exist in 19. And their next step, finding the real killer, would begin right back at that evidence box that had sat useless for 4 long years. The case had flipped, and the hunt for the true perpetrator had finally begun. The DNA confirmation that Evan was the victim immediately transferred the case to the new generation cold case unit of the Alaska State Troopers, where young investigators were equipped with modern forensic technology that did not exist in the Anchorage lab. Under cold white light, evidence box done 9745-1, Bear Creek was opened for the first time in 4 years. Detective Rowan Hale, the cold case team leader, lifted out each item inside: a strange keychain, a dark-colored fabric cord, a small bag of bloodstains, old crime scene photos, as if reopening a door that had been hastily slammed shut. Hale ordered every piece of evidence re-examined with new technology: trace DNA analysis, skin cell separation, electrostatic swabbing to collect microscopic samples adhering to metal, fabric, even the grease trapped in the lettering on the keychain. Procedures that had been impossible in 19. The preliminary results left the entire team silent. The DNA on the keychain belonged to neither Marina nor Evan, and it did not match any criminal profile in the state of Alaska, the clearest sign yet that the killer was not a locally recorded resident. The small bloodstain found near Marina's body was re-extracted using new methods, yielding a far more complete sequence than the 1997 analysis. This time the conclusion was certain. The blood belonged to an adult male, not Evan, and had no record in Alaska's DNA system. Meanwhile, material analysts discovered several dark brown microfibers embedded in the fabric cord, most likely fibers from the seat of an older pickup truck. That detail instantly reminded everyone in the room of the old witness statement about a dark-colored pickup that had once been dismissed as noise. But now, with physical evidence, that possibility returned like a needle piercing the silence of the previous 4 years. Someone had stopped a vehicle, approached the two teenagers, separated them from the gas station area, and dragged them deep into the woods. Hale immediately rebuilt the entire crime scene model, for the first time making two victims, one single perpetrator, the primary scenario. Marina was killed near Bear Creek. Evan was bound and moved to Lost Lake, more than 10 miles of forest away, a distance only someone intimately familiar with the terrain would dare travel. The killer was not just stronger than Evan, he was confident, prepared, and knew the area well enough to choose routes that left no clear tire tracks. When the DNA report reached Hale in the third week, the wording was short but marked a turning point: no match to any individual in the Alaska system. That pushed the most dangerous hypothesis to the forefront: the perpetrator came from another state, a cross-country trucker, a drifter, or someone who moved constantly along interstate routes, committing crimes in multiple places without ever leaving fingerprints or DNA in Alaska. Hale requested the search be expanded to the federal CODIS database, comparing against missing persons and homicide cases from 1996, 1998, along trucking routes from Oregon, Washington, and Idaho to Canada. The detailed profile described the perpetrator as most likely male, large build, with habits or an occupation that involved driving an older pickup truck, possibly forestry, long-haul transport, or seasonal labor in Alaska's woods. When all the data was pieced together, the final piece of the reopening phase appeared. This was not a random crime, it was the work of a methodical predator. At the same time, Ellison, the now retired original investigator, received the phone call. After hearing the news, he said only one sentence: "I knew that evidence wasn't meaningless." The evidence he had collected, powerless against 1997 technology, had now become the new foundation of the investigation. When Hale finished the report to her superiors, the last line was not an order, but a confirmation: probability perpetrator, from another state, high. Federal trace expansion required. And for the first time since 1997, the entire cold case team felt they were standing right behind the person who had turned two teenagers into victims. One more link, and he would be exposed. When the federal lab's DNA comparison results arrived in Anchorage, Rowan Hale knew immediately that they had just reached the biggest turning point since the case was reopened. The DNA samples from the keychain and the small bloodstain did not match anyone in Alaska's criminal system, but produced a partial match with a family branch in Oregon. This was genealogical DNA, the tool that had cracked many seemingly hopeless cases, and this time it opened a new path to the deaths of Marina and Evan. When the family tree was built, the list of people with close genetic ties to the sample narrowed to fewer than 20 names, and among them, one name stood out like a dark beacon: Darren Whitlock Jr., born 1969 in Medford, Oregon. His record was not long but full of red flags: public disturbances, bar fights, aggressive behavior toward neighbors. None serious enough to predict murder on their own, but impossible to ignore when paired with the next discovery during the summer of 1997. Whitlock Jr. had lived in Kenai, Alaska, on a seasonal work contract. Kenai was less than a 2-hour drive from Seward Highway and the Bear Creek area where Marina was found, and the timing of his presence in Alaska matched perfectly with the teenager's disappearance. Hale immediately requested every record on Whitlock: tax returns, employment files, temporary addresses, coworker lists, anyone who had ever interacted with him. One detail stopped the team cold: Whitlock Jr. owned a 1983 black single-cab pickup truck. That description matched exactly the only witness statement, claiming Evan and Marina had gotten into a stranger's vehicle, a statement once dismissed because cameras had captured nothing. But now, with genealogical DNA results, every seemingly disconnected piece suddenly fit together in an alarming way. It did not stop there. When old Kenai coworkers were re-interviewed, many described him as moody and prone to disappearing from the job site for days at a time with the excuse hunting alone. One of them clearly remembered Whitlock bragging, "I know a way into the woods where a truck can pass without leaving tracks." That statement sent chills down Hale's spine because one of the case's enduring mysteries was the complete absence of any vehicle entry or exit route, despite other evidence showing the victims had been moved by vehicle. Hale noted in the file, refusal to provide DNA sample does not equal guilt. But combined with all other factors, this reaction reinforces the likelihood that the perpetrator is the remaining individual, Darren Whitlock Jr. She began reorganizing every piece of data on Whitlock. Residency records showed Darren working in Kenai at the exact time Marina and Evan disappeared. Work schedules showed him absent without explanation for several days during the week the teenagers went missing. DMV records confirmed ownership of a 1983 black pickup, the exact model matching the microfibers found on evidence. Kenai witnesses described him disappearing into the forest for days. From an investigative logic standpoint, every point lined up chillingly so. When Hale looked at the newly rebuilt timeline board, she saw 3 lines converging: Darren's presence in Alaska in June 1997. A 5-day gap when he was missing from work, exactly coinciding with Marina and Evan's disappearance, the DNA evidence directly tied to the Whitlock branch. Not a note contradicted the hypothesis that Darren had approached Evan and Marina, killed Marina at Bear Creek, and taken Evan deeper into the Lost Lake Forest where his remains were found 4 years later. And then one small but extraordinarily heavy piece of information surfaced. A former Kenai site supervisor remembered Darren driving his black pickup out of camp at noon on the day of the crime, saying he was going for a drive. That noon was the exact blind spot between 12:30 and 13:15 when Evan and Marina vanished. When asked why he remembered so precisely, the supervisor answered simply, "Because that day he was gone longer than usual. I had to write it in the log." With that statement, the final piece clicked into place. Darren did not just match the DNA. He did not just match the clothing, vehicle and work schedule. He left the job site at the exact moment he needed to leave, on the exact day he needed to leave, and headed toward Seward Highway. Hale carefully compiled every new conclusion into the file, then underlined the last 2 lines of the report to her superiors. All genealogical data, physical evidence, timeline, and witness statements converge on a single individual, Darren Whitlock Jr. Request warrant for direct DNA collection for absolute confirmation. When Hale set down her pen, the entire room fell silent. After more than 4 years lost in doubt, wrong turns, and missing pieces, the case finally had a clear shape. The killer was no longer a shadow at the edge of the forest. He had a name, he had a history, and now he was about to face the truth that science had followed all the way to his doorstep. After the 3-generation family tree narrowed the suspect down to a single name, Darren Whitlock Jr., Hale moved on to the investigative step she knew would be especially critical: mining the memories of the people who had lived alongside him. DNA, physical evidence, and the timeline had painted the initial picture, but it was everyday behavior that could reveal the true nature of the suspect most clearly. The first person they tracked down was Darren's now adult son. He looked momentarily confused when the summer of 1997 was mentioned, but after a few minutes of hesitation, the memories seemed to unlock themselves. He said, "That night, my dad came home with scratches on his arms. His clothes were covered in mud. He was quieter than usual." He described Darren walking into the house, irritable, reeking of alcohol and damp forest. He went straight to the bathroom and slammed the door. When he came out, mud still clung to his wrists even though he'd washed. When Hale asked if he knew where Darren had been, the son shook his head. He just said he'd been out for a bit, but he had never come home that late before. That detail made Hale jot a note immediately. The mud-soaked clothes and scratches on his arms matched exactly what Evan had endured before being bound, and the time Darren returned home lined up perfectly with the window in which Marina was murdered. Hale next located Darren's ex-wife, the woman who had left him not long after the murders. She was guarded at first, but when Hale mentioned Evan and Marina, her face fell as if she had been waiting years for this day. She described life with Darren as tense, marked by explosive temper, days-long disappearances into the forest, often taking alcohol and a knife with him. Then she said the thing Hale needed most: he always kept a big coil of heavy rope in his toolbox. But after one trip when he was gone for 3 straight days, that coil disappeared. Hale asked for the timing. The woman frowned, then remembered clearly: end of June 9, the rope vanishing at the exact time Evan was bound, matching the ligature marks on his wrist bones, and very likely the source of the dark fibers found near Bear Creek. This was no longer coincidence. The third witness, an old neighbor who lived near the forest, provided the final piece Hale never expected to get. When the case was brought up, he stared out the window, silent for several seconds, then spoke as though a weight was lifting. "That night I heard his pickup truck doing a fast 3-point turn in the woods. I'd lived next to him long enough to know that engine sound." Hale pressed him. He nodded firmly. He said the tires screeched on the dirt, as if the truck was carrying unusual extra weight. When it whipped around, the headlights swept across the trees and kicked up a cloud of dust, clear signs of speeding on a narrow forest track. When asked if he actually saw Darren, the neighbor replied, "Didn't see the person, but that truck engine, I couldn't mistake it." It lined up chillingly with statements collected over the past 4 years. A dark-colored pickup truck had been seen around the time Marina and Evan vanished. Time, direction of travel, driving manner, all matched. Hale compiled the 3 independent statements. Son, Darren came home with scratches and muddy clothes that exact day. Ex-wife, heavy rope disappeared at the precise time Evan was bound. Neighbor, sound of the black pickup doing a hurried turnaround in the forest that night. 3 people, 3 different vantage points, 3 separate stories, yet all painted one unmistakable image. Darren Whitlock Jr. was at the right place, at the right time in the right condition to commit the crime. When those statements were placed alongside the genetic genealogy results and the physical evidence, suspicion of Darren was no longer suspicion. It had become a powerful chain of circumstantial proof. What Hale now saw was no longer scattered puzzle pieces, but the full structure of the truth emerging. Darren left the job site, drove his black pickup into the woods, picked up 2 hitchhiking teenagers, killed Marina, bound Evan, and took the boy deeper toward the Lost Lake area. As Hale wrote the final line of her report that night, Darren Whitlock Jr., behavior, timeline, vehicle and DNA all consistent. Direct DNA sample required to lock it down. She knew it was time to confront him. The statements from Whitlock's family and neighbor had made Darren the undisputed prime suspect, but to move toward an arrest warrant, Hale needed to prove one crucial thing. The alibi Darren gave 25 years earlier was fake. In the 1997 file, Darren claimed that on the day Marina and Evan disappeared, he was not anywhere near Kenai or Seward, but in Fairbanks, nearly 500 miles from the crime scene, visiting an old friend. At the time, with no evidence to refute it, police noted it but couldn't fully verify. Now with DNA and fresh witness statements, told Hale this was the linchpin she had to destroy. She started by tracking down the old friend Darren had named Rick Donner, now living on the outskirts of Anchorage. Rick hesitated when he heard the reason for the visit, but eventually agreed because he didn't want to keep the secret anymore. When Hale mentioned the night Marina and Evan vanished, Rick went quiet for a long time. Then his eyes dropped as though the weight of 25 years finally crushed his defenses. His voice grew quieter. "I lied. Darren asked me to." Hale stayed calm on the outside, but every word tightened something inside her. Rick explained that in 1997, Darren showed up at his house only once, late July after the case was already statewide news. He asked Rick to say the 2 of them had gone fishing in Fairbanks, on the exact day of the murders. Rick initially refused, but Darren flew into a rage, trashed part of his shed and growled that nobody wants to get mixed up in this. Out of fear and thinking it might just be a misunderstanding, Rick agreed. What caught Hale's attention was Rick's final remark. "I don't know what Darren did, but I know one thing for sure. That night he was not in Fairbanks." With that single sentence, the alibi that had shielded Darren from serious scrutiny for 25 years began to crumble. Hale didn't stop at the statement. She immediately requested the landline records for the address Darren claimed to have stayed at that entire night, Rick's house in Fairbanks. In 1997, landlines were the primary means of communication, and Hale knew call logs might still exist in the phone company's archives. When the records arrived, the data said what Darren never expected. From 5, the entire window when Evan and Marina disappeared, there was not a single incoming or outgoing call from Rick's number. Rick had claimed he received several calls that evening from coworkers and friends, yet the log proved the opposite. That meant Rick was not home, so his memory of the evening could not possibly match. Darren could not have been at Rick's house, because no one was there to answer when investigators called to verify. Thus, Darren's alibi wasn't just shaky, it was non-existent. The clincher came when Hale re-examined Darren's 1997 work records from the Kenai construction site. The old files had been moved to storage, but thanks to the cold case team's persistence, they located a handwritten timesheet stored in a secondary warehouse. When they flipped to late June 1997, Hale spotted the anomaly immediately. In the time column, Darren worked full shifts every day, breaking only for scheduled lunch. But on the exact day Marina and Evan vanished, next to his name was written, "Left mid-shift 5 hours." Reason, none given. Hale cross-referenced that window with the case timeline. Marina and Evan were last recorded on gas station surveillance at 12:27 p.m. Then came the gap from roughly 12:30 to 1:15 p.m. The precise period the timesheet showed Darren walking off the job site without explanation. In 1997, it hadn't raised red flags. In 2021, with the new evidence, it became the perfect link tying Darren to the crime scene. Hale placed the 3 new pieces of evidence on the board. Rick admits the alibi was fabricated. Phone records prove Darren was not in Fairbanks. Timesheet shows Darren unaccounted for 5 hours on the day the teenagers vanished. 3 arrows, all pointing to the same moment and the same direction. Seward Highway, Bear Creek, black pickup truck. There was no longer any reason to believe Darren was innocent. The 25-year-old alibi he had relied on to stay out of the crosshairs had been completely demolished. In the investigative team meeting, Hale stood in front of the newly updated timeline board. She looked each detective in the eye and said, slow and deliberate, Darren Whitlock Jr. was not in Fairbanks. He was on Seward Highway, and he had both the opportunity and the means to reach Evan and Marina. Ellison, though retired, had been invited to the briefing. He studied the new timeline, then let out a long breath, not from exhaustion but from finally seeing the truth he had sensed all along take its rightful place. We waited 25 years just to prove what I suspected on day 1, he said. There was a third person in those woods that day. In the official report, Hale wrote the pivotal conclusion, Darren Whitlock Jr.'s alibi completely false, no remaining basis to exclude him as the perpetrator. With those words, the 1997 case finally had the key to unlock the entire truth. The next and most decisive step was obtaining a direct DNA sample from Darren to compare against the crime scene evidence. After 25 years, the truth was finally about to be named. Alibi collapsed. The cold case team returned to Bear Creek, the spot where Marina's body was recovered, to compare everything Darren had claimed 25 years earlier against the actual terrain. The area had grown thicker moss and young trees now obscured parts of it, but the major landmarks, the main boulder, the dry creek bed, and the trail leading down to the narrow ravine, remained virtually unchanged. Hale, Ellison and a forensic terrain specialist measured every location, recording angles, distances and features that would allow them to reconstruct the killer's path. In the 1997 report, Darren had been briefly interviewed because he lived in the area, and he firmly stated he only ever drove along Seward Highway, and had no knowledge of any trail leading deep into Bear Creek. That statement couldn't be verified at the time, but it was clearly documented. Now, comparing it to the real topography, Hale spotted the contradiction. The spot where Marina was found was almost half a mile off the highway, hidden from view, with no signage whatsoever. An ordinary person who had never entered that area would be unable to describe the terrain accurately. The police realized this was their chance to make Darren slip. Hale decided to set a strategic trap during the next interview. In an interrogation room not as intense as a formal session, but enough to lower his guard, Hale began with casual questions: how long his shifts were, who he knew locally, where he liked to fish. Darren answered confidently, trying to appear relaxed. After about 20 minutes, Hale abruptly shifted gears and asked in an offhand tone, as if it were a minor clarification, "Do you know any trails around Bear Creek, like the one with that narrow ravine right by the creek?" That ravine had never been released to the press and did not appear in any public file. It was mentioned only in internal reports, a slot so tight one person could pass but 2 people side by side could not. It was where they found trampled grass and a snagged dark fiber the day Marina's scene was processed. Darren was mid-sip of water. His motion froze for a fraction of a second, a tell Hale noted instantly. Then he answered too fast, too smoothly, as if by reflex rather than thought. "Yeah, that narrow one, right? It's to the left of the boulder field right where the trail bends. Right?" Hale showed no reaction. She simply stared at him, letting silence stretch, just long enough to build pressure. Darren grew flustered, glanced at the mirrored glass, then backtracked, claiming he was just guessing because I hunted nearby. But it no longer mattered. Hale wrote one line in the interview log: "Suspect accurately described non-public crime scene detail." Instantly, that became powerful contextual evidence, more than enough for a legal search warrant of Darren's home. The warrant was signed before sunset. The team descended on Darren's house in Sterling, Alaska. He lived alone. The small house was cluttered with old gear, tools and random items typical of an itinerant construction worker. In the garage, Hale found an old moss-green plastic bin shoved behind some lumber. Inside was a jumble of junk: wrenches, fishing gear, a few rotten coils of rope and an old pair of leather work gloves. It all seemed ordinary until the forensic tech held the gloves under light. Reddish-brown leather, worn threads on the outside and inside trapped in the lining, several distinctive dark fibers. Hale immediately recalled the 1997 report at Marina's dump site. Investigators recovered a dark fabric fragment caught on a branch near drag marks, identified as leather blend, but technology at the time couldn't analyze or match it further. Now that fiber type, per the technical file, was produced in late 1980s, early 1990s work glove lines. The gloves in the bin matched the 1989 production run exactly. Under the microscope, the lab found microscopic fiber fragments virtually identical to the 19. Moreover, the torn inner lining still held traces of soil and plant matter consistent with Bear Creek soil in summer. It was no longer coincidence, no longer suspicion, no longer theory. This was the first undeniable physical link tying Darren to Marina and Evan. When Hale returned to the interview room with the new evidence, the air was so thick Darren could no longer fake calm. He avoided her eyes as if he knew the game had changed. Hale placed the gloves on the table. "You know what these are?" Darren swallowed hard, voice flat. "Just old gloves." Hale sat down and spoke slowly. "They contain fibers that match the ones recovered where Marina was found. The same location you described perfectly a few hours ago." In that moment, Darren understood he had exposed himself too far. His silence became the first unofficial admission. At last, after more than 2 decades hidden by fog, rain, rumors and misdirection, the killer began to emerge from his own mistake, and the investigation, for the first time in 25 years, had reached the point of no return. Preparing the arrest warrant. The interrogation room was bathed in pale yellow light, the space seeming to contract around the cold metal table. Darren Whitlock Jr. was led in, his handcuffs removed, but the red marks still clearly imprinted on his wrists. He sat down with feigned calm, but Hale immediately noticed the slight tremor in his shoulders, the telltale sign of a man who knew he'd been backed to the very edge of the cliff. From the moment those old gloves were found in the plastic bin behind the garage, Hale knew this would be the decisive interrogation. All she needed, to complete the file for the charging warrant, was to let Darren reveal the cracks he could no longer control. Right from the first minute, Darren's statement began to warp. He opened with the all-too-familiar line, "I was just driving along Seward Highway that day. I didn't see anybody." Hale didn't challenge him. She let him talk, let his defenses tangle themselves like the trap he'd unwittingly set. "Just driving through?" Hale asked, as if confirming a harmless detail. "Yeah, I was just driving to work. But you previously stated you were in Fairbanks." Darren stiffened. I got mixed up. I don't remember clearly. It was 25 years ago." That was the first change in his statement, and Hale simply noted it without comment. Hale kept pressing on the innocuous point. "Did you walk down to Bear Creek at all?" "I didn't touch anybody," Darren stressed, louder than necessary. That was the second change. He was answering a question no one had asked, an instinctive defensive reaction that only appears in people trying to hide something. Ellison, watching through the one-way mirror, whispered to the behavioral analyst standing beside him, "He's in free fall." Hale continued, carefully feeding him questions, with the casual air of someone just asking about that day's weather. "Do you remember what you were doing that afternoon?" Darren clenched his hands beneath the table. "I don't remember that night. Everyone keeps wanting me to remember something I isn't even there for." The third contradiction. If he wasn't there, why the need to remember? If he was only driving past, why deny touching anyone? If he was truly innocent, why had his story shifted repeatedly in under half an hour? Hale let him twist himself deeper into his own net, then slowly placed a folder on the table, but didn't open it. The turning point came when Hale removed a small object from an envelope and placed it in the center of the table. The keychain dropped on the trail in 1997. Evidence listed in last part of the file. Back then technology wasn't advanced enough for deep analysis, but now they knew it carried skin cells sufficient for DNA extraction. Hale set it down with 2 fingertips, as if it still carried traces of the past. Darren saw it, and the change in his face was so obvious it needed no recording. His hands trembled slightly, his throat swallowed hard, Beads of sweat instantly appeared on his temples. "You recognize it?" Hale asked. Darren immediately deflected. "I don't know what that is." "Really?" Hale tilted her head. "We found it on the Bear Creek Trail, right at the narrow rock crevice section. You remember that spot?" Darren took a short, sharp breath, his back leaning slightly away from the chair, the reaction of someone pushed to their limit. Fourth statement. He tried to hold the line. "I just saw it in newspaper photos back then." Hale struck like a blade straight into the weakness. The detail about the keychain was never released to the public. No paper ran a picture. No news report mentioned it. It was classified under internal investigation information. Do not disclose. Darren realized he'd slipped. He stopped looking at Hale, stopped trying to square his shoulders. His eyes locked onto the keychain as if hypnotized by his own past. The behavioral analyst invited to this interrogation stepped in beside Hale and began dissecting point by point in an ice-cold tone. "Miss Whitlock, in 30 minutes you have changed your story 4 times. Just driving through. I didn't touch anybody. I don't remember that night. I saw the keychain in the paper." All 4 contradict each other. Darren's eyes darted. His breathing grew heavy. This was not the reaction of an innocent man. This was the reaction of someone who knew layer after layer of evidence was closing around him. The analyst continued, voice low but sharp as a scalpel. "Your body is exhibiting a classic freeze-flight-fight response. You can't run, you can't fight. So you're freezing. You know why?" Darren stayed silent. "Because you know exactly where that keychain was dropped, because you know the Bear Creek terrain, and because the DNA on that keychain is now strong enough to match." Darren shot to his feet. "What DNA?" "I didn't." Hale cut him off, placing the DNA report on the table. "We reanalyzed the samples recovered from Marina's backpack strap, from fabric in the rock crevice, from scratches on branches. All 3 match the Whitlock family genetic profile, and now the sample from the keychain yields a result. 98.7% match to your biological profile." Darren froze, as if someone had just slapped the reality he'd been clinging to. "No way, He had no more answers. No more defense, only the slow disintegration of a facade that had rotted years ago. The interrogation dragged on for nearly 2 more hours. Darren kept switching tones. Denial, blaming memory, lashing out at Hale, then falling silent and staring at the table. But the more he spoke, the deeper he sank into contradiction. Not one sentence explained why his DNA was on 1997 evidence, why he knew the location of the crevice, why his gloves matched the fiber sample, why his alibi had been proven false, why he clocked out mid-shift at the exact time Marina and Evan vanished. He did not confess, but he could not refute a single piece of evidence. And in the law, that was enough. When Darren was handcuffed again, Hale read the arrest warrant. Based on DNA samples, matching physical evidence, and contradictory statements, you are under arrest for the murders of Marina Doyle and Evan Hartley. Darren looked at Hale, eyes blinking rapidly, as if still searching for an escape hatch. But there was none. For the first time in 25 years, the truth was no longer lost in the fog. It stood right in front of him, clear, undeniable. And Darren Whitlock Jr., the man who had hidden behind a mask of normalcy for 2.5 decades, finally collapsed under the weight of the crimes he committed. The trial of Darren Whitlock Jr. took place in the fall of 2022 in Anchorage, Alaska, drawing intense media and community attention from those who had lived under the shadow of the case for over 2 decades. Darren entered the courtroom with weary eyes and a face that revealed the collapse that had begun the day he was arrested. Gone was the calm defiance of the early interrogation days. He sat at the defense table, hands clasped, gaze avoiding all contact. But this trial was no longer a battle of words. It was the convergence of DNA, physical evidence, genetic genealogy, and fragments of memory from long ago, all pointed inescapably at a truth he could no longer evade. The prosecution opened by reconstructing the full timeline of June 28. The room fell silent as those moments played, 2 young teenagers with backpacks, hitchhiking on Seward Highway, unaware they were steps away from a predator waiting in the woods. The prosecutor highlighted the unexplained gap from 12th, perfectly aligning with Darren's unaccounted-for break, a detail silent yet screaming to be heard. Next came the DNA presentation. The forensic expert took the stand, carefully explaining how they extracted DNA from 25-year-old fabric fibers, from Marina's backpack strap, from trace amounts on the dropped keychain, and from residue inside the old gloves found in Darren's garage. The results flashed on the screen, genetic comparison charts, showing clear matches, Whitlock family markers, and a direct sample from Darren matching it. Even the defense attorney could not challenge the science. He only tried to persuade the jury that DNA can transfer through intermediaries, that the timeline is too old for accurate memory, or that there is no direct eyewitness. Every argument was swiftly dismantled by the prosecution's airtight chain of evidence. Then came the genetic genealogy segment. A Parabon Nanolabs expert took the stand and presented a 3-generation Whitlock family tree, a complex web of DNA leading straight to Darren's branch. As the expert displayed the simulation, Darren dropped his head into his hands, unable to look at the genetic structure, accusing him in the most undeniable way possible. When the prosecution displayed the 1997 fiber recovered from the crevice, alongside photos of the old gloves seized from Darren's home, the courtroom murmured. Same fiber, same material, same color, same wear pattern. Science could not be mistaken. But the most shocking moment came when Darren's now adult son took the stand. Voice thick with emotion yet steady, he told the court, "That night my father came home very late. His hands were covered in long scratches like he'd been clawed by rot. The right leg of his pants was caked in dark mud. When I asked, he said he tripped. But my dad never went anywhere after dark." Those words were the final knife through Darren's defense. The defense objected, but the judge overruled. The testimony perfectly matched the 1997 investigation notes. Bear Creek that day had thick, dark mud and sharp rock fragments. When the prosecutor tied it all together, DNA, witness testimony, alibi contradictions, physical items, fibers, timeline, and Darren's precise description of a never-publicized location, the jury only needed a few glances at one another to know the picture was complete. They left to deliberate in heavy silence. Darren sat motionless, head bowed, face in shadow, with nothing left to grasp, no evidence to save him, no story left to fake. 6 hours later, the jury returned. The foreperson stood and declared firmly, "We find the defendant, Darren Whitlock Jr., guilty of the murders of Marina Doyle and Evan Hartley." Darren closed his eyes, shoulders rigid, but said nothing. The judge delivered the final sentence, each word, echoing through the courtroom, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. There was no applause, no cheering, only a wave of relief that washed over the rows of Evan and Marina's families, a long overdue but deserved justice. After 25 years, the summer of 1997 was finally closed with a truth that could no longer be buried, and the world of Darren Whitlock Jr., the man who once hid in the vastness of Alaska, was locked away forever behind the doors of a 2022 courtroom. The courtroom, which had been heavy with tension throughout the trial, fell into a different kind of quiet. No longer the strain of an unsolved mystery, but the quiet relief of a truth finally revealed. Marina Doyle's family embraced, many openly weeping now that the real killer had been brought to light. On Evan Hartley's side, 25 years of bottled-up pain burst forth, this time not from loss, but from the vindication they had waited half a lifetime for. That same afternoon, the Alaska State Troopers held a brief press conference. At the podium, Lieutenant Hale announced to the public, "Evan Hartley has been officially confirmed as a victim. There is no evidence, past or present, indicating he ever harmed Marina Doyle." In that moment, Evan's mother clutched a photo of her son and sobbed. She had lived with the double agony of losing her child and having the public suspect he might have been the killer. For 25 years she endured whispers, sidelong glances, and news stories that once painted Evan as a fugitive suspect. Now all of that was erased. Evan was no longer trapped in the gray zone of suspicion. He was restored to his rightful place, an innocent child, victim of a ruthless predator. Hale also emphasized that this case was a testament to the power of modern forensic science. One tiny detail, a keychain dropped on a trail, woke up a case frozen for nearly 3 decades. No piece of evidence is too small, no clue unworthy of preservation. The cold case team that had pored over every brittle 1997 document stood behind Hale, silent but proud. Investigator Ellison, who had worked the case from day one and retired still carrying it, was invited to speak. Voice trembling, he said, "We never believed Evan was the perpetrator, and we knew Marina deserved real justice. Today, both kids finally have it." When the press conference ended, a reporter asked Hale what finally solved the case after so many years. She smiled, but her eyes still carried the weight of someone who had seen hundreds of cold files. Persistent, and faith that the truth always leaves a mark, no matter how hard time tries to cover it. On the final day of the file, Hale returned to the Alaska State Troopers' cold case storage room. Dimly lit by fluorescent tubes, rows of tall steel cabinets stood like endless blocks of the state's memory. She opened drawer 97 BC 214. Inside was a thick stack of yellowed documents, photos of Marina, photos of Evan, old Seward Highway maps, original reports, Darren's false 1997 statements, everything waiting for the day it would be deciphered. Hale added the final documents to the file, 2021 DNA results, photos of the recovered gloves, Darren's son's testimony, verdict, dated September 22. She took a pen, crossed out the old line, and wrote on the cover, "Closed. Justice achieved." The click of the steel drawer sliding shut echoed through the quiet room, a small sound carrying the weight of 25 years of the Seward Highway disappearance case from the summer of 1997 had finally found its ending. Justice, though late, is still justice. In the story Alaska 1997 Cold Case Solved, arrest shocks community. What haunts readers is not just the crime, but how a case thought buried forever can be resurrected through persistence, technology and meticulous attention to the smallest detail. When connected to life in the United States today, the story reflects familiar issues, the danger of trusting someone's normal exterior, like Darren Whitlock Jr. How easily early misinformation can lead to wrongful suspicion like Evan endured, and the power of preserving evidence, even things that seem trivial, like a keychain dropped on a trail, or a fiber in a narrow crevice. From the story, 3 lessons Americans today can apply to real life. Never dismiss unusual signals or small details. The old gloves and keychain that seemed worthless became the keys to solving the case after In life, sometimes the smallest things, an odd behavior, a contradictory detail can be critical signals for protecting yourself or your community. Stay persistent and believe in the truth, even when public opinion is against you. Evan's family endured 25 years of suspicion yet never lost faith in their son. In today's America, where misinformation and social media noise can distort reality, holding firm and resisting snap judgments is crucial. Modern technology is only truly powerful when paired with human integrity. DNA and genealogy solved the case, but the investigators' persistence, people like Hale and Ellison, was the deciding factor. In life, technology can assist, but ethics and responsibility are what create real change. The story reminds us that no matter how long it takes, justice can still arrive, if we don't give up, don't ignore small signals, and never abandon the truth. Thank you for following to the end of this 25-year journey for justice. Please subscribe to the channel, so you don't miss more powerful true stories like this one. See you in the next video, where we'll keep opening files that seemed forever asleep, and bringing the truth back into the light.